One day before my wedding, my father called me with a voice I didn't recognize. "I can't walk you down the aisle tomorrow," he said. My mother picked up the other line just to add, "Just walk by yourself, it's not the end of the world." On my wedding day, I didn't walk alone. When the doors of the chapel opened in Banff and the guests turned to see whose arm I was holding, my father, sitting stiff in the second row in his rented tux, went the color of the tablecloths. Before that call, I thought I had everything figured out. "My name is Holly, I'm 31, and I grew up in a house in Oakville where the lawn was always trimmed into perfect lines and nobody ever raised their voice because raised voices weren't elegant." My father, Gerald, ran a mid-sized commercial insurance brokerage that he'd built from nothing, and my mother, Pauline, sat on 2 charity boards and never let anyone forget it. We weren't old money, we were new money trying very hard to look old, which in my experience is its own kind of exhausting. I had an older sister, Felicity, 3 years ahead of me, and from the time I could form memories, the math in our house was simple. Felicity got the recitals filmed on the good camera. I got the camcorder our uncle didn't want anymore. Felicity got driving lessons with my father personally in the parking lot of the Bronte GO station. I got bus fare and a "you're more independent anyway." It wasn't cruelty exactly, not the kind you could point to and say, "Look, there, that's abuse." It was just absence, dressed up as fairness. "We treat you both the same," my mother used to say, which was true only if you didn't count anything that actually mattered. When Felicity married Adrian, a guy from a family that owned a chain of golf courses across southern Ontario, my parents practically built a shrine. The wedding made the local paper's society page. My father gave a toast that ran 11 minutes, I counted. I moved to Vancouver for work not long after that, partly for the job. I do project management for a mid-sized tech firm, and partly because Toronto, or really Oakville, had started to feel like a stage set I wasn't cast in. It was exactly 24 hours before my own wedding when the call came. I was in a hotel room at the Fairmont in Banff, my dress hanging on the back of the closet door like a held breath, my best friend Nassie's pinning the last bobby pin into my hair for the rehearsal that afternoon. My phone lit up on the dresser. "Dad." I smiled, actually smiled, because I figured he was calling about logistics. Had the groomsmen's flights landed? Did he need the address for the welcome dinner? "Holly, we need to talk." No hello, no warmth. Just that flat, board meeting voice he used when he was about to deliver bad news he'd already decided wasn't his fault. "What's wrong?" I asked, my stomach already dropping in that specific way it does when you sense the ground shifting before you can see why. "I'm not going to be able to walk you down the aisle tomorrow." I actually laughed, a short disbelieving bark, because surely this was a joke or a scheduling conflict or something fixable. Nassim stopped pinning my hair and looked at me in the mirror. "What do you mean you can't walk me down the aisle? You're standing in this hotel right now, Dad. You flew in 2 days ago." "It's complicated," he said, and then, in the background, I heard my mother's voice, tight and rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for her cue. "Just walk by yourself, Holly. It's not the end of the world. Plenty of brides do it. It'll look very modern, very independent." I asked them, point blank, what was actually going on, because nothing about this made sense unless there was a medical emergency I didn't know about. That's when my father told me. Felicity had called them that morning, sobbing, saying that watching me get a big showy mountain wedding while her own marriage to Adrian was falling apart. Apparently there'd been an affair, apparently there'd been a fight that morning, was more than she could handle. She said if Dad walked me down the aisle, smiling, celebrating, while she was going through the worst week of her life, she would never forgive him. And so my father, 59 years old, a man who had walked into boardrooms full of men twice as intimidating as his own daughter, decided the simplest thing to do was simply not show up for me. Again. "She needs us right now," my father said, like that settled it, like there was no version of the universe where 2 of his daughters could need him in the same week. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, not yet. I just said very quietly, "Okay," and hung up, because I had learned a long time ago that begging my parents to see me had never once worked, and I wasn't about to debase myself the night before my wedding trying again. Nassim, God bless her, didn't say "I'm sorry" the way people do when they don't know what else to say. She said, "Who do you actually want to walk you down that aisle tomorrow? Not who's supposed to. Who do you want?" And the answer came to me almost instantly, surprising even myself with how little hesitation there was. My fiancé's name is Desmond. He's a paramedic, calm in a way I didn't know people could be calm until I met him, the kind of calm that comes from having literally held people's lives in his hands and learned what actually counts as an emergency. Desmond's father, a retired firefighter named Walter, had become, over the 18 months Desmond and I had been together, more of a father to me than my own ever managed to be in 31 years. Walter remembered my coffee order. Walter called on my birthday without being reminded. Walter had once driven 4 hours in a snowstorm because I mentioned in passing that my car battery had died in a Costco parking lot. I called Walter that night. I was shaking so badly I had to sit down on the edge of the hotel bed to dial. When he picked up, I just said, "Walter, my dad's not coming tomorrow. Would you walk me down the aisle?" And there was this pause, not a hesitating pause, more like the pause of a man making sure he'd heard correctly, and then he said, "Sweetheart, I would be honored. I'll be there at 8 sharp." That was it. No drama, no conditions, no last-minute family loyalty test. Just yes. I didn't tell my parents. I let them assume, right up until the moment the chapel doors opened the next afternoon, that I'd be walking in alone, or that I'd softened, or that I'd begged my father to reconsider. I let them sit in the second row of the small stone chapel just outside Banff, mountains stacked up behind the altar like something out of a postcard, and I let them wonder. The doors opened at 4 o'clock, the string quartet shifted into the processional. And on my arm, in a navy suit he'd had tailored specifically for the occasion, was Walter. Broad-shouldered, silver-haired, beaming like he'd won something. I heard the gasp ripple through the room before I even fully stepped through the doorway. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. I watched my father's face, 3 rows deep on the left, go from confusion to recognition to something close to gray. Walter walked me slow, the way you're supposed to, the way my father never once practiced with me even though I'd asked twice. Halfway down the aisle, Walter turned his head and looked directly at my father, not unkindly, not smug, just steady. The look of a man who understood exactly what was happening and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. My father couldn't hold the eye contact. He looked down at the program in his hands like it had suddenly become very interesting. I want to say the ceremony itself was where the story ended, but anyone who's ever had a family like mine knows the real performance happens at the reception. We held it at a lodge with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Lake Louise, the kind of view that costs a fortune in Canadian dollars and is worth every cent if your family behaves itself for even 3 hours. Mine did not make it that long. Felicity showed up to the reception in a dress that was, unmistakably, almost the exact shade of my own gown. Not white, technically, more of a champagne that read as bridal in every photo we have. She'd worn it on purpose. I knew it the second she walked in, chin lifted, scanning the room to see who'd notice. People noticed. You don't grow up watching someone perform victimhood for 30 years without learning to read every single one of her tells. Dinner went fine, more or less, if you don't count the way my mother kept loudly telling guests at her table that weddings are about family, really, when you think about it, like she was rehearsing a defense for later. The toasts went fine. Desmond's brother gave a genuinely lovely speech. Walter, when it came his turn, said something simple about how family isn't always the people who share your blood, it's the people who show up, and half the room was in tears, and I watched my father's jaw tighten like he was chewing glass. It was during the dancing, after the cake, that Felicity decided she'd had enough of being merely uncomfortable and wanted everyone else to share the feeling. She marched up to me at the edge of the dance floor, Adrian trailing behind her looking like a man who badly wanted to be literally anywhere else, and said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "I hope you're happy. You humiliated Dad in front of everyone." "Do you know what people are saying right now?" I asked her, genuinely, what exactly she expected me to do. Get married alone because her marriage was falling apart. A fact she hadn't even told me herself, a fact I'd learned secondhand from my own father the night before my wedding. "You could have asked me to walk with you," she said, which was such an absurd thing to say, given that she was the reason my father stayed home in the first place, that I actually laughed again, that same disbelieving laugh from the hotel room the night before. "You're the reason he didn't come, Felicity." "That's not fair," she said, and her voice cracked exactly the way it always did right before the tears arrived, on command, a skill she perfected sometime around age 14 and never once let atrophy. "You don't know what I'm going through. Adrian's been," and she stopped herself, glanced at Adrian, who was now staring very intently at the floor. My father appeared then, drawn by the rising volume, doing what he always did, smoothing things over for Felicity's benefit while treating my feelings as the disruption. "Girls, please, this is supposed to be a celebration," he said, and I felt something in my chest that had been coiled tight for 31 years finally, quietly, snap. "It is a celebration," I said, "of my marriage." which you weren't here for, because you chose her, again, the way you've chosen her every single time since I was 7 years old. My voice wasn't even loud. I'd had 31 years to write this speech and I didn't need volume to deliver it. My mother, predictably, swooped in to defend him, saying I was being dramatic, that this wasn't the time or the place, that I was ruining my own wedding with this nonsense, as if I were the one who'd called 24 hours before to cancel on my own daughter. And that's when Felicity, who had clearly decided the only way out of this conversation was to escalate it past the point of return, reached out and slapped me. Open palm, across the face, in front of roughly 140 guests, the string quartet still playing somewhere behind us like nothing had happened. The room went silent in that specific way a crowded room goes silent, where you can hear ice settling in glasses. I didn't slap her back, I didn't need to. Desmond was beside me in 2 strides, not aggressive, just present, a wall between Felicity and me, and Walter wasn't far behind him, and for the first time in my entire life I understood what it actually felt like to have people who would step in front of you, without being asked. It was my Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, who finally said what nobody else in that family had ever had the spine to say out loud. Aunt Carol had flown in from Calgary, had watched this entire dynamic play out at every family gathering for 3 decades from the sidelines, and apparently decided that tonight, finally, was the night. She stood up from her table, walked over, and said, loud enough that the whole room heard it, "Gerald, Pauline, I have watched you two treat this girl like an afterthought since she was in pigtails, and I am done pretending I haven't noticed. She didn't humiliate anyone tonight. You humiliated yourselves the second you decided not to show up for your own daughter." My father tried to wave her off, tried the same smoothing tone he used on me a minute earlier, but Aunt Carol wasn't having it. She kept going, calmly, devastatingly, bringing up specific instances, the driving lessons, the recitals, the way they'd paid for Felicity's entire wedding outright, while quietly suggesting Desmond and I consider something smaller, receipts, basically, 30 years of them, delivered in front of the one audience my parents had spent their whole lives performing for. Felicity tried to interrupt, tried to redirect it back toward her own crisis, her own marriage falling apart, and Aunt Carol simply said, "Your marriage falling apart is not your sister's fault, and it never gave you the right to put your hand on her face." Adrian, to his credit, finally found his spine somewhere in his back pocket and quietly told Felicity they needed to leave. They did, nobody stopped them. What came out over the following weeks, because of course it did, because families like mine cannot resist explaining themselves, even when explaining themselves makes everything worse, was that Felicity's marriage had been unraveling for almost a year, that Adrian's family's golf course business had taken a serious hit, and that my parents had quietly been propping up Felicity and Adrian's lifestyle for months, dipping into retirement savings to do it, while telling me, when I'd once mentioned struggling to save for a down payment in Vancouver's market, that I needed to learn to budget better. I found this out from Aunt Carol, not from them. My parents have not called to apologize, not really, not in any way that resembles actual accountability. My father sent one email 2 months after the wedding that said he was sorry I felt that way about the whole situation, which is the kind of apology that isn't one, and I recognized it immediately for what it was. Because I'd been collecting non-apologies from him my entire life and had become something of a connoisseur. I haven't cut them off completely. I'm not interested in performing forgiveness I don't feel, but I'm also not interested in carrying around a grudge heavy enough to crush the life Desmond and I are actually building. We bought a small house in North Vancouver in the spring, nothing fancy, a garden in the back that I'm slowly learning not to kill. Walter comes for dinner most Sundays. He brings dessert every single time, usually something his late wife used to make, and he tells me stories about Desmond as a kid, and some nights I catch myself thinking, this right here, is what having a father was supposed to feel like all along. My father, sitting pale in that second row, watching another man do the one thing he couldn't bring himself to do for me. I think about that image sometimes, not with the satisfaction I expected to feel, but with something closer to grief. Grief for the version of him that maybe could have shown up, if he'd ever once decided I was worth the inconvenience. The blood between us is still there, it just doesn't mean what it used to.